Last night was no red wave. It was maybe a ripple of many rivulets, which we're going to talk about with this great panel. I just want to single out the choice issue was so important. Think of the Amendment 2 in Kentucky, just codifying reproductive freedom, reproductive rights. It gives a mandate to Congress. I stayed up until John Fetterman accepted, which was an extraordinary moment for many reasons we can talk about. But last night was hopeful. It's not a blue wave, though there are more progressives in the Progressive Caucus, and there were some great Delia Ramirez in Illinois, Jonathan Jackson, Illinois, Greg Cesar, Lena Hidalgo, Harris County Commissioner. Counterposed by a state I love, but it's having trouble, Florida, and that's to be discussed. But Ron DeSantis emerged, he and Trump bickered. But let me just close by saying you have great panelists here. Come to thenation.com, where we are reporting hour by hour with deeper analysis and thinking. And it's a night into today and into the next years that deserves attention in the way the nation, I think, reports. And I will close by to central part of the 2016 political conversation. So we go deeper, and there's much to mine. I believe in organized people. Let's do that. And thank you again for being part of the nation. Your support enables us to do the reporting that we do, will continue to do, and onwards. And I say that with better cheer than I thought I would this morning. Don, you're muted, I believe.
Mute myself. Okay. Thank you, Katrina. I hope everybody can hear me. Welcome to the WTF Just Happened Nation panel. I don't know whether I'm violating any confidences by saying that yesterday afternoon, Katrina and I were discussing how dark a cover we could manage for the next issue. So it's a great pleasure not to have to follow that through. It was a great pleasure to see my friend John Fetterman finally win the seat that he has been seeking for a long time and could have won 6 years ago. I just want to say that for the record. It was, I saw all the Red Ripple talks this morning, including in the Nation, but for me, the line that's going to stick with me last night is from an email exchange with our own John Nichols, where he talked about a red trickle rather than a red wave. I think a red trickle, particularly for a man my age, is more evocative. Anyway, so let me introduce our very distinguished panel. And although I can't see him on my screen, I know he's here because I saw him a minute ago. I'm going to start with Elie Mystal, the nation's justice correspondent, who's been described as the funniest lawyer in America and is the author of the recent New York Times bestseller, Allow Me to Retort, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution. You can read Elie on www.thenation.com at least twice a week, most weeks, and in our print magazine every month. Joan Walsh, who is in the center of my screen. And by the way, Joan, when I checked the title of your book, I put in Joan Walsh White, and the next word that came up was hair. And now, now in my search, so now everybody can see why. Joan Walsh is one of the nation's national affairs correspondents and is the author most recently of, let's see, What's the Matter with White People? The Finding Our Way in the Next America. And that's certainly pertinent to discussing what did and didn't happen yesterday. So it's a pleasure to see you. And Joan, are you joining us from Georgia?
I am. I am
Fantastic.
joining you from Atlanta.
From Atlanta, where Joan filed a fantastic dispatch on both hope and disappointment last night. So thank you, and that's up on our site now. On the right of my screen, but perhaps not the right of the nation's political spectrum, Chris Lehmann, our new Washington bureau chief, former editor of the New Republic, former editor of the Baffler, and author most recently of The Money Cult, Capitalism, Christianity, and the Unmaking of the American Dream. You can also read Chris on www.thenation.com, as you can Joan, and often in print. And if I was going to list John Nichols's books, our other national affairs correspondent, we'd probably be here longer than we have. So I'm just going to pick out not even his most recent, but one of his most recent, and perhaps the most pertinent title today, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party. So welcome, panel. I'm going to start, I suppose, by asking you all, who was the big loser last night?
Donald Trump.
Yeah, I know. I think that's too easy, Don. Too easy.
Well, but no, let's enjoy this for a minute. We'll get into the less pleasurable. Let's start on a high note. I mean, you know, Trump candidates lost across the country. Trump's rival for the Republican nomination, insofar as he has one, and so far as anybody's been willing to stick their head a little bit above the parapet, Ron DeSantis had, you know, what from the point of view of Trump haters was a great night in Florida. You know, we can talk. In fact, I would love to hear the panel's thoughts on whether we should worry more about a DeSantis run in 2024 than a Trump run. But am I missing something about Trump appearing weakened by last night? Oh, yes, one more thing. That heavily trailed announcement that Trump has been, you know, dragging through social media all week. Well, the backdrop for that is kind of blown to pieces by last night. So I think that's a big loser. Now let's go in turn. And I'm going to start, I guess, with Joan. Big winners from last night, or winners that you particularly were glad to see, either one.
Well, you know, it isn't called yet, but you know, Katie Hobbs in Arizona and Mark Kelly in Arizona. Carrie Lake and Blake Masters are two of the most hideous people in the country who've ever, you know, graced our political scene. So you know, it's not called. It looks pretty good for the Democrats there. So that was a huge relief to me. You know, I was relieved to see Kathy Hochul win. I didn't even think it would be as close as it got. That was disappointing. We've got to talk about New York Democrats in a lot of different ways. Something's really wrong there. Everybody's, you know, parachuting off to Georgia or Arizona or wherever to do their, you know, their election work because we live in a blue state, so we don't have to do any work there. But that was really a pathetic showing for the New York Democrats. So winner, loser, and Trump was the big loser. He's having a very bad day, so I enjoy that.
Yeah, no reason to get up with a smile this morning.
Exactly.
Chris Lehmann, big winners that you particularly noticed?
Well, you know, we've mentioned John Fetterman already. I think he's a big winner, both in terms, I think, of shifting the momentum for a Democratic majority in the Senate by picking up that seat. And I also think he was a win for economic populism, which amid all the pundit chatter leading up to the election, everyone was supposed to be freaked out about inflation. They were saying the economy is really weak for Democrats. And here you have someone who was like foursquare behind all the income supports out of the COVID crisis, supported Biden's student loan relief package, which interestingly, Tim Ryan, who lost in Ohio running as a populist, did not support that. And given the salience of the youth vote, I think, you know, and it's also the case in Nevada, which is close, that the Democratic incumbent did not align behind the Biden student aid. In terms of losers, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Lauren Boebert, who I, if this were later in the day, I would be drinking
Toasting.
something other than coffee in
Toasting.
celebration. Joan mentioned Masters and Carrie Lake as two of the worst people. There is room for Lauren Boebert on that list, and she will not be darkening the halls of Congress, which I don't think I certainly did not see that coming. And I think that underscores the idea that this, far from being a red wave or a trickle, we have to remember, it's almost always the case in midterm years that the out party that doesn't hold the White House gains significantly. That is not happening this year. And I think we have to look long and hard beyond, yes, things like Trump was still it was a referendum on Trump. But I think, I was among the people who were skeptical about the closing pitch that Democrats mounted about democracy being on the ballot. But I think in retrospect, that had some real traction. And obviously the Dobbs, I think another winner here is the mobilization behind reproductive rights. We saw, the abortion ban referendum go down in Kentucky and in 4 other states. Pro-abortion referenda won easily. So that was a clean sweep. So all this talk, Joan wrote about this earlier about, the Dobbs effect waning, that turned out to be wrong. And it's a great thing that it did.
Yeah, no, I think the Dobbs effect is one of my nominees for the big winners last night.
Yeah.
Elie, big winners and.
Yeah, so in addition to the Orange MAGA King for losers, I really think that the mainstream media in general and the Beltway and corporate media, Beltway and New York media specifically, like huge L. Y'all got it wrong again, and you did it in such a way as to just do nothing but freak people out for 6 months, knowing absolutely nothing. I swear to God, I never want to see another poll for as long as I live. All right, like the New York media needs to, like, there is a general thing that the corporate media needs to, like, look inside of itself and figure out not only why it keeps getting things wrong, but why it keeps getting things wrong in favor of Republican narratives. Like what are you doing within your newsrooms, within your still largely white newsrooms, that you always seem to be parroting an incorrect Republican narrative and shoving it down people's throats in the months and weeks and days leading up to every election? This ain't the first time. No, they've gotten this wrong, but so it's a pattern at this point, right? And so I think they're huge losers, but they won't think they are because they're on TV, right? They won't actually like internalize that they are losers and they are wrong. They will just move on to the next one and without that kind of internal self-reflection about what they're doing. And we're already seeing it with them creating DeSantis as the next big giant threat, right? They're already pumping DeSantis up, even though DeSantis has not yet proven that he has any valiance beyond the wang of America in Florida, right? So big loser for the corporate media. Another big loser, Kevin McCarthy, man.
Yeah.
Even if Republicans take the House and it looks like maybe that is an ungovernable coalition that I would not want to trade places with Kevin McCarthy right now for like all the tea in China. I wouldn't want that job for anything. He's going to learn what Paul Ryan has learned in the past, what John Boehner has learned in the past. That is not a fun job when you have, kind of best case scenario for him right now, he's going to have like an 8-seat majority, maybe, like best case, good luck, Kev. Couldn't happen to a worse guy. So those are the losers. The winners, it's harder because as we're saying, it was a Republicans still probably won the House, and the Senate is still like extremely close. So it's when we think about it's like what won is the idea that we get to do this again in 2024, which was not a fait accompli at the beginning of the night, right? Like if like 2 days ago, we
Right.
couldn't be sure that we were going to get to have another kind of free and fair election in 2024. Now it looks like probably we will get to have another election in 2024. So I guess that's a win. The other win, and it sticks a bit in my craw to say this, but Joe Biden just had the best night of a first term incumbent president like ever. And while I have kind of like serious disagreements sometimes with his strategies and his policies and what he does, he's not wrong, right? Like you can't say that he's wrong. Like and it's just, and I think Chris made this point about Tim Ryan. The candidates who stayed on Biden's message overperformed. They did extremely well, and it was the candidates that started to try to backtrack off of Biden's message. It is, you know, when you look at Ohio and look at Tim Ryan, there are lots of reasons why that was, you know, why he loses that race by 7 points despite running a great campaign. One of them is, as Chris said, he backed off of some of the Biden agenda. You know, another reason is that he kind of pissed off black voters, which you kind of can't do and be a Democrat, right? So in his desperation to court white moderate conservative voters, he really kind of turned off the black community in Ohio, in Cleveland, and Akron. And that's one of the reasons why he lost that race. So I think that I don't see how you can look at this election as anything else other than an endorsement of not just the Biden agenda, but like, and again, this is the part that sticks in my craw, the Biden strategy for pumping out that agenda seems to have, generally speaking, worked. So good job, Joe.
Hey, John Nichols. Well, you're muted, John, or at least I can't hear you.
Yeah,
Can
you're.
someone help? Can
you're-
someone help?
So since
Okay.
we're all starting with losers, I will start with my biggest loser, and it's by far Ron DeSantis. He has now become the face of the Republican establishment, and the Donald Trump wing, which is the dominant wing in the party in most of the country, will be out to get him. And Ron DeSantis is going to be very easy to get. He is indeed Ron the Sanctimonious. And I look at him and see him as Scott Walker 2.0. I think he is a
Very good.
Republican governor that that Republican pundits and even a lot of mainstream pundits see as, oh wow, this is a guy who knows how to do big things. The translation, I think, to the national stage will be ugly and rough. And I can tell you that in races around the country, the Republican governor that people wanted to have come and campaign with them, even though Ron DeSantis went everywhere and forced his way in, the governor they wanted was Glenn Youngkin from Virginia. He was the one who was much more high profile in states around the country. And I think that DeSantis has kind of ended up with a big political target on him. And so I think that makes him a loser. I agree with most everybody else on polls and media, et cetera, et cetera. So let me take us over into the winners, which I'm more excited about. To my mind, the biggest winner is Barack Obama. And I don't think there's any question that if you look at where the mood was on the day that Barack Obama went on the campaign trail, and that where he did it with skills that were universally celebrated, I just think that he, for better or worse in the Democratic Party, signaled himself to be the party's best communicator, and to a greater extent than anyone else, he put the issue of Social Security on the table. He did it with his first stop. He amplified it with each stop. And I genuinely think that when we look honestly at a lot of these close races, I think we have to accept that Obama did something major there. And it was an intervention of great consequence. Quickly, two other winners. I will go with folks who say the choice movement. I think that there was a big effort to write the choice movement off. And I will bring up one person, and that's Dana Nessel in Michigan. Dana Nessel, to a greater extent than anyone else, argued at every turn that choice was a winning issue. She fought to get that choice referendum on the ballot in Michigan. She was out front and bold, and I just have very little question that Dana Nessel, Attorney General of Michigan, will eventually be either a U.S. Attorney General or a presidential candidate or something, because she's that good at it. And parallel to that, I do think Democratic governors and gubernatorial candidates were big winners. It's the lost story of this because we cannot get ourselves out of the Washington mode. Democratic gubernatorial candidates picked up at least 2 more governorships, perhaps 3 if Arizona goes the right way. And the interesting thing is they did so as a more diverse, more progressive, and frankly more strategic group than they've ever been in modern times. We will have a LGBTQ woman governor of Massachusetts, a state that has been white male leadership, except for a couple of brief interruptions for a very long time. With Maura Healey, you're going to have first black governor of Maryland. You're going to have a lot of younger governors, and it's just these victories are huge, and they came in places very unexpected.
They also,
yeah.
no, it's one thing that struck me is it also seems to suggest that at the state level, people like to be governed by Democrats.
They do, and these Democrats ran more progressive than a lot of the national messaging.
Right.
They were on Medicare expansion or Medicaid expansion. They were on legalizing marijuana was a universal for these folks. And so the last thing I'll say quickly is I think the other big winner is folks who didn't give up on rural voters. And at the top of that list is John Fetterman. John Fetterman ran on a strategy that he would go to every county and every town of any size in the state. It clearly paid off for him. Tony Evers and Mandela Barnes, although Barnes narrowly lost in Wisconsin, did the same strategy. And when I looked at the map this morning, I saw islands of blue voting in rural areas that had been lost for 8 years that were back. And I think there's no way that Democrats win in major states without at least holding their own in rural areas. And Fetterman delivered that message, even making it central to his victory speech. So those would be my winners.
Okay. I want to push back a little bit for a second on the Biden agenda argument that Elie made. Partly because it's just my prejudicial belief is skeptical on that. And partly because in Ohio, Tim Ryan, who didn't run the campaign I would have run in Ohio, but did outperform Biden in Ohio considerably. I mean, Biden was, or actually no, he came close to the same margin as Biden in Ohio. Biden lost by 7 points, and
Yes.
Ryan lost by about 6.5 points.
It followed Ohio pattern.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is I'm not sure you can generalize from that, although, if you pick issues, and certainly student loans in a state with as many students, that was a stupid thing to walk away from.
Candidates who ran on the infrastructure bill, candidates who ran on student loans, candidates who ran on democracy, which again, as Chris was saying, we weren't sure that was actually going to stick. Candidates that ran on democracy, these candidates generally won, or at least generally did better than we kind of thought they were going to do. So there's the other thing is that you got to look at everybody was looking at Biden's approval ratings. Everybody was saying that this is the approval rating band in which the party in power takes it on the chin.
Right.
He didn't do that. We were looking at inflation. So this is the inflation band where the party in power takes it on the chin. Biden didn't do that. And there are lots of reasons. I think like the maybe even the more macro reason is the candidates matter, right? Like I think we saw a lot of ticket splitting. I think we saw a lot of what kind of, again, Beltway and corporate media would call weirdness, but actually it was like people liked this candidate more than they liked that candidate, and they weren't straight party line voters. So like all of that goes into the pot. But let's put it like this. If I can't quite get you to say that Biden's a huge winner, can we at least agree that he wasn't a drag?
No, I think Biden had a much better night than I or any other, and maybe you before this gave him credit for that, but certainly I was reluctant, and I think he had a better night, and I think we should acknowledge that, absolutely. I want to talk about ticket splitting for a second, and maybe even drill down into the democracy question. And I'm going to send this one to Joan, but anybody else who wants to jump in, please do. How do we explain the contrasting fortunes between Elaine Luria in Virginia and Spanberger? They both ran hard on democracy. Spanberger also ran hard on choice. And I don't know that maybe that was the secret sauce that carried her across. But from the outside, it looked like they should have gone the same way and they didn't. And I know you spent a lot of time in Virginia, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Virginia Beach, it went blue-ish for a while, but it is a very, very conservative place. There's a lot of military people. It's less diverse racially and socioeconomically than other parts of Virginia. I think we were kind of fooled. I spent time there. I don't know, what year was it, Don? Was it 2021?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, it was, and I went down there and I profiled a state senator who lost to Jen Kiggins, who beat Luria. And it was, everybody saw it as the sort of preview, the, run up practice. She turned out to be a better candidate than people would have liked. She does not come off as crazy. She plays up her medical past. She's just, I don't know. I didn't think Luria was going to lose. I will say that, despite what I'm telling you now. I just thought she was too good a candidate. And that, you also, we talked about the democracy question. I mean, she's on the January 6th committee. Like, I thought that would be something in her favor.
That's Chris Lehmann, you think the January 6th committee may have cut against her?
Well, in that district, yes, I think,
Yeah.
Joan was saying that it is pretty conservative, much more. The two other Virginia districts that went Democratic are Northern Virginia. They're sort of Metro DC. They've been trending blue for a long time. Virginia Beach, I think, was sort of an outlier because of Trump. And now I think it's, it would have taken a lot more, I think, commitment of resources from the National Party to bring Luria across. And even then, I'm not sure what would have happened.
So speaking
can I just offer one quick thing on that as well?
Sure.
Just to say, I think that membership in the January 6th committee is great if you represent a hyper-democratic district.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
But this
yeah,
is
Jamie Raskin is my.
He's going to be fine for that, right? But
He
this
proves.
is the old Senate Foreign Relations Committee chair crisis, right?
Right.
And for years, like during the Vietnam War and afterwards, Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairs got beat, right? And the argument was, oh, you're spending so much time working on that other thing, you're not very interested in me. And I think in a swing district, I hate to say it because I love the work the January 6th committee is doing, but I think in a swing district, that's not what you emphasize. And one other quick thing on ticket splitting too. I think we have to acknowledge that the ticket splitting in some states was, very much influenced by issues of race. And Wisconsin, where I live, Mandela Barnes, who is a hyper qualified candidate, who was the lieutenant governor of the state with Tony Evers. You separate Mandela Barnes off, he's running his race, and he runs, tens of thousands of votes behind Tony
about 3
Evers.
or 4 points behind, right?
Yeah, and that what you look at is the reality that something like, and this is jaw dropping, but maybe 100,000 people voted for Tony Evers, one of the most progressive governors in the history of Wisconsin, and Ron Johnson.
Yeah. Well,
and in Georgia, where I will shift now to Joan.
Yeah, I mean, you have, Brian Kemp voters who also voted for Raphael Warnock. So there's race, but there's also gender.
Gender, of course.
Stacey Abrams ran such a great race 4 years ago. It was so painful to watch this unfold. But I think that she was hurt by being perceived as having, put herself out to be vice president. She was, viewed as kind of becoming a national celebrity and leaving some Georgians behind. I don't think that that's accurate or fair, but I heard that a lot. So that's interesting. But, it's also, I wrote in my piece today, there's still, this is not, Elie will jump in, this is not my story necessarily, but there's still, issues of misogyny in all of our communities. And they tried to face it head on. They did every night. They did, Black men have something to say events. She won Black men. Let's be clear.
Overwhelmingly.
Overwhelmingly. The people who really should be ashamed today are white women in Georgia. So, let me get that out of the way. But, there is a perception, among Black women that she did pay a little bit of a price for being a woman. And I can't disagree with that. I mean, I think that Warnock ran a very good campaign. He ran on a good campaign for what he's going to have to do. And Elie, if you tell me I have to stay here, I'm sorry. I'm coming to your house tonight. John Nichols.
Joan, it's only a month.
John Nichols told me yesterday I have to stay here.
It's only a month, Joan.
And you'll be close to the cruise. You'll be there.
Right, you can just pop down to Florida and catch the cruise. But no, look, the
I want
fact
to come
that
home, you guys.
I know you
Well,
want to
I
come
do
home,
wanna-
but the fact is George is a good
Can I jump in
story.
on the Stacey Abrams thing? Because yes, Stacey Abrams won Black men. The media narrative that Black men were going to abandon Stacey Abrams, that is just wrong. That's part of why I'm saying the media really took the L in this election. That was a narrative that was baked in that didn't play out in the actual polling data. I do think that Stacey Abrams took a hit for being a Black woman, but that's with white women. I mean it is white women that punished her for being a Black woman, which is a narrative that should be baked in but doesn't get talked about enough. And look, when you just straight up look at the exit polls nationally, right? And I know national exit polls in a midterm election aren't always the most useful thing. But when you just look at the exit polls nationally, what you see, as usual, is 65% of white men voting for the Republican candidate, 55% or 55 to 52% of white women voting for the Republican candidate, and a majority of everybody else voting against Republicans. At some point, white voters have to accept some personal responsibility for the choices they're making. Because
I did write a book called "What's the Matter with White People." I don't know what else you want me to do.
I'm not saying you personally.
I know. I'm kidding.
But there's also the one thing, Elie, if I can just tell you one quick thing though. Take a look at independent women, which is a fascinating thing. Independent women of all races, usually a big bellwether in a midterm election year. They usually are the ones who swing against the party in power. Right. This time, independent women, I think it was 54 to 42, a pretty wide margin, voted for the Democrats. And then when you drill down into that, it was the choice issue. So I think you're right to talk about the voters themselves, but I also think that if you look at the number of ads that the Democrats actually put up on choice before the very end of the campaign, they did not make it in many of these states as central an issue as they could have and should have. And so I do think that the parties themselves and the billionaires who donate to the Democratic Party tend to, they still tend to not figure out how to reach out in ways that they should. So I do think there's a dual track there.
So let's talk for a minute about donating to the Democratic Party. And
why would you do that?
Well, because there's another bright spot for those of us who are economic populists, and that is the demise in New York of Sean Patrick Maloney. And I think we should take a minute to celebrate that fact that here's the head of the DCCC, which some people don't understand, even though, and I'm going to blow my own horn here, I wrote a piece at least 4 years ago saying the DCCC is not on our side.
That's right.
They are not on our side. They were not on our side in this race. They were on his side. He spent $800,000 or $600,000 of their money on his own race. He bumped out Mondaire Jones from his district, losing a great progressive voice in Congress, and then he went down. So, I don't know whether
the Crowley of this cycle, yeah.
And can we note also that he was also one of the prime movers on the strategy of having Democrats spend money to help to quote unquote nominate the weakest Republican. which sometimes worked. And I'm not going to deny that that worked in some cases, particularly in the Pennsylvania governor's race. But when I watched Mandela Barnes in Wisconsin without money, without resources in September, when he was getting beaten up in the most vile possible ways on television, I was wondering, boy, maybe if some of that money that Maloney and the other insiders had, and the Democratic Party had steered into Republican primaries, maybe if that was available, it might have been a little easier for Mandela Barnes in Wisconsin.
The New York Democratic Party is a joke, right? Like I stay registered as a Democrat because I want to be able to vote in the primaries places where I live, where the actual election is fought. But like every election, I did it this election too, I vote straight down the working families party line ticket, partially just to keep them in the game, but also partially because the party is a joke here. I am from Long Island. I live in Westchester. I am, if I had, spent some more time in Hoboken, I'd have all of the greater New York suburbs covered, right? And people really don't understand how Republican these areas are or can be without investment, right? And so when you look at what happened on Long Island, especially to me, my kind of home base, right? Lee Zeldin, a popular congressman for Long Island, couldn't beat Hochul. I mean, I agree with Joan, like it was closer than maybe we would have liked, but he was never going to beat Hochul as long as people from Manhattan and the 5 boroughs showed up, and they did, right? So but what it does seem like he did was increase turnout, Republican turnout on Long Island, which is already a Republican area, which Democrats can easily lose, as they lost in this election, if they don't focus on it, and they didn't. And everybody was telling them this. So actually, if you look at progressive sources, if you look at progressive Twitter even today, what you see already are people like Alexander Ocasio-Cortez being like, we got to change the leadership of this party. And State Party Chair Jay Jacobs, he needs to be out. This is a very small scale disaster for the Democratic Party in New York, and there should be actual accountability. Maybe what we should try to do is run actual Democrats and actual progressive candidates in some of these areas, because the other variance that you see throughout New York State, the candidates of color generally won. The white male candidates in New York generally lost. Democratic candidates in New York generally lost. And at some point, again, there's one, and if I could just end with this, one of the things that I think I'm trying to get people around their heads around this morning is there has to be accountability for some of these failures, for some of these defeats. There just has to be. There has to be a soul searching and a autopsy about what went wrong and how to get better. Because if you don't do that kind of basic homework, you just keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again.
Well, if we're talking about accountability, what about on the national level? It was a good night for Biden. So for those of us who think maybe he shouldn't run again, last night was not the clear signal. To put it as mildly as I'm going to, but in a way that I hope Elie will find it in his heart to agree with. And maybe Kevin McCarthy's stewardship of the House, when he gets it, will make us appreciate Nancy Pelosi. But it's clear that there needs to be new leadership there too.
And there will be.
And there will be.
Yeah.
So, are there other national figures that we want to dump on? Are there other national storylines that we want to draw here?
I just want to do one thing. After kind of crapping on the white people in general, as I am wont to do, white voters under 30 went Republican. We have the first Gen Z congressman in Florida, and an otherwise terrible situation that happened in Florida. We got the first Gen Z congressman in Florida. One might argue that one of the big national stories, even as Don, I agree, this was a great signal to run a however old, 120-year-old man for president again, and whatever we're going to do about that, right? At some point, the Democratic Party needs to get younger, because young people are demanding it.
and here's they are now demanding it. That's the problem. They young people are actually like some young people are stepping up and running. Folks like Maxwell Frost, who you mentioned, Summer Lee in Pennsylvania, and others. But look, if you look at the polling data, the young people are most inclined toward Bernie Sanders, right? So it is an authenticity issue, I think, with the Democratic Party, and that for young people, I think they do respond more to authenticity. And if you want to dump on folks in the Republican Party, I mean, the fact is or Democratic Party, I apologize, they never had a youth
Often hard
strategy.
to tell the difference, Joe.
Well, there you go. But they lacked a youth strategy. You had the president of the United States do a couple of things on climate and on student loan. But remember, when you're dealing with student loan debt, right, you are not dealing with people under 25 that much, right? You are, although they may be interested in it as they age out. If you want to talk to young voters,
You don't know what pain is yet.
I know. You want to talk to college voters, right? You talk about ending the cost of college, right? Addressing that. And there just wasn't a strategy, and it was agonizing to watch. And yet, when I look at the data, it is absolutely true that young voters saved a number of candidates.
That's the other point.
I'm glad you mentioned the Bernie factor, John, because I always go back, in 2008, there was this big youth movement in the Democratic Party, and there was an establishment candidate who resisted it. And the party figured out how to embrace that youth movement and, won 2 successive presidential cycles as a result. In 2016, you had the same structural forces kick in. There was this big youth movement behind Bernie. The party establishment could not distance
they rejected it
far enough away from that youth movement. And you saw what happened in 2016.
And so I could tell you about this year.
Right.
Bernie Sanders reached out and said, I'm ready to go to campuses, right? The data says that people will turn out. The party leaders were, by and large, resistant to that. They were like, oh, no, they even have ads up that attack Bernie Sanders. We shouldn't do that. So Sanders finally turned to Tom Steyer and Next Gen, and Next Gen helped to get Bernie out. He did 20 campuses across the country, drew huge crowds. I'm not giving him the credit that you would give to Obama or to other folks, but what I'm telling you is that having a youth-oriented strategy, right, that does speak to people, that has people who can connect, right, that has issues and that has investment and a program, for Democrats, that should be like the easiest thing in the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the exit poll I saw from yesterday showed that in a lot of these key races, you had young voters turning out upwards of 70% for Democratic candidates.
Oh, it's overwhelming.
No-brainer.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to start the question and answers from the audience at this point. We've got a lot of great questions queued up in the chat, and also I have some being fed to me by our behind-the-scenes team. And I want to start with the question that we've touched on, but maybe people want to put a little more meat on the answer, which is, this is from Cynthia Bauman, and it's, how did the DCCC scheme of supporting the Trumpiest candidates in the primaries pan out? She talks about New Mexico and goes into a lot of detail there. We had from Paige, somebody else also wanted to know about the Pied Piper strategy. It clearly, I think it was John, it might have been Chris, said it didn't help the Republicans in the Pennsylvania governor's race, but are there other races that people want to
I hate this strategy. I think there's a lot of reasons to be opposed to it, but I have to acknowledge, in places like New Hampshire, it was probably a saving grace. And so, because Maggie Hassan's easy win in New Hampshire is critical to potentially holding the Senate. Again, I say this as somebody who really doesn't like the strategy and thinks it's got a lot of problems, and I would probably still argue against it. But honesty requires me to tell you that, I think that it probably did save some seats and some positions for the Dems.
as Joan said earlier, we're waiting for final returns in Arizona, where two of the worst election deniers were up for
Right.
statewide office. But in general, it was among the big losers were election deniers. We
Some of
were
the worst
really
of them.
worried in important swing states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, or actually, no, it was Wisconsin, Nevada. You would get AG candidates or Secretary of State candidates who are election deniers, and that could set up a rerun of the January 6th strategy that would work in 2024. And fortunately, that didn't happen. And I'm like John, I hate this strategy because, among other things, it relieves Democratic strategists of doing the hard political work of persuading people to come over to your side based on your actual agenda. You're just using fear. You're using the specter of, we can't afford to, give power to these people, which is absolutely true, but you're not doing the work.
Well,
But it's still, as John says, honesty compels us to acknowledge that the loss, the pretty impressive loss of election deniers throughout the country suggests that there was some Machiavellian return from this strategy this time out.
well, one of the reasons I assume John and you, Chris, and I would all argue against this strategy, even if it sometimes works, is because it's also a distraction from doing the real work of
That's
building,
right.
Right.
And
building
it
a
also,
coalition.
it also is usually done on behalf of centrist Democratic candidates who haven't built out a campaign that has a dynamic appeal, right? It's more
Well,
like
that's-
we'll get a Republican who is so bad that our boring candidate can win. And that's
Well, I think that's right. And
Yeah.
this speaks to a question we have from Bill Gallegos, which is it possible to build off the foundation of this election to develop a broad progressive coalition for 2024? In other words, where are the places where you see, something that actually we'd like to see happen on a bigger scale in 2024? And I'll throw out a first answer to that, which is with Fetterman. One of the things that interested me the most about Fetterman was that picture of him and Obama holding hands, holding their arms up at a rally.
yeah.
Because I was with Fetterman the day that he found out in 2016 that Obama was endorsing Katie McGinty.
I know.
And, that was a pattern that we've seen all along that Chris was just talking about, which is when progressives play by the rules, we find out that the coalition won't back us. And yet they did. Say what you like about the Pennsylvania Democratic Party, they went all in for Fetterman. You saw ads for Fetterman by John, by Casey. You saw by Bob Casey. You saw the organization turning people out in Philadelphia in great numbers, as they can do when they want to. But are there other races that you all saw where you can see the beginnings of this coalition? And and I take very much Elie's point to heart that you can't win as a Democrat if you piss off black voters. But
So let me give you a quick example, and other people will have better ones. But Michigan, the fact of the matter is that the women who lead the Michigan Democratic Party at this point, Governor Whitmer, Jocelyn Benson, Dana Nessel, they have done, they made choice central and very important. They raised it up higher than other parties. That was very smart. It proved, polling tells us it was good. But they never let go of economic issues. They are all very, very close to unions, very, very deeply committed in a UAW state to being aligned with unions. And also all three of them poured enormous energy into Detroit and into black communities across that state. And so the bottom line is I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of all their politics. I think that they are different people and you can make your distinctions. But if you want to look at building a coalition and building something real in a state that Donald Trump won in 2016, I would say the Michigan model is a pretty significant one.
Well, and they flipped the legislature.
It looks like they're going to flip the legislature.
Like they're going to flip the legislature, which is unbelievable.
And
Yeah,
they won a
it's
couple of
40 years,
congressional
yeah.
races. They won congressional races in some swing areas that were important. So the bottom line is, I think the measure of success on something like this, or the measure of something like this, is success. And if you're looking at Michigan, I think you're seeing some things happen there that are important.
Chris, you were going to say? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Ellie, and then
Go
we'll
ahead,
go.
Ellie.
I think you take all the money out of Florida, you take all the money out of the fool's gold that is Texas every goddamn time,
Yeah.
and you put it in North Carolina, and we
Yeah.
have the first black woman senator from North Carolina.
Yes, that was, I mean, that was a
Criminal.
perfect example of that race of media malpractice, because nobody was writing about North Carolina, and it was clear that that was agonizingly close. That was the most painful part of the night for me last
Yep,
night.
and we didn't spend enough money in North Carolina, because I think, again, we always chase Florida and we always chase freaking Texas. And so my other thing about building this progressive coalition, I swear to God, if Democrats run another white male in Texas, I love Beto. I think he's a great guy. Love to have a beer with him. Hope that he has a great career. He's not going to win Texas.
Mhm.
And at some point, like it is so frustrating to me when you look at just, they put up the little pictures with the red and the blue and the red, right? And the in these Latino heavy districts in Florida and Texas in the Southwest, they have found Latino Republicans to run for them,
Yeah.
right? And the Democrats
Shouldn't
can't
be hard.
seem to do that.
Nope.
How is that even possible? Because again, there's going to be a huge media narrative. Oh, Latinos flipping towards Republican. No, not really. Not really.
No.
No.
The majority of Latinos still voting with the Democratic Party, but we can't seem to find Latino candidates to run against Latino Republicans. And of course, we do find them. We just don't vote for them in the primaries. So again, you gotta need to start moving money out of Florida, which is just gone. That's a red state now, right? It's like you move money out of Florida, you put it into North Carolina, and you invest. If you're gonna go after the fool's gold in Texas and some of these other states, you got to start investing in candidates of color in that case in those states that have some ability to turn out the non-white vote in those states and see what happens there, because we have done it with trying to run non-Latino candidates in Latino districts, and it doesn't work out for Democrats. We have to start, again, have accountability and start changing how we run things here.
Chris Lehmann. Or has Ellie said it?
Yeah, no, I have very little to add to it. As usual, all I can say in reply to Ellie is yes. But,
Can we add states to Ellie's list though?
oh, absolutely.
Because I'd like to add Ohio.
Ohio, yeah.
Ohio is the quadrennial, in fact, biennial heartbreak. The last time Sherrod Brown can win Ohio, right?
Yeah.
Give him that. But the last time any other Democrat than Sherrod Brown won Ohio was Barack Obama 10 years ago.
Right.
I mean, and yet massive amounts of money go there. And the truth is, this is a painful thing, because we at one time say we want the 50-state strategy, but the fact is that there's never been a 50-state strategy. There has always been a bias toward a handful of big states that folks in Washington think they can pull across the line, rather than actually building out a strategy in mid-sized states that would, I think, be far more beneficial. And that includes North Carolina. And frankly, I mean, look, I knew he wasn't going to win, but Charles Booker in Kentucky was a fantastic candidate with a fantastic strategy, running in a state where choice was on the ballot. And he didn't get an inch of help from the National Party.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's in a state with a Democratic governor, by the way.
Now,
So-
we talked about losers, and we started on that, actually. And David Kowalski has a name he'd like to add to our list, and I want to see what your response is. And that's Mitch McConnell.
Yeah.
Did McConnell overplay his hand? Did this non-red wave, was it in some sense the result of both Dobbs and the Supreme Court packing?
Well, and as John has pointed out in past meetings, it's also, the Senate in many ways was a gift of Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump forced these unelectable candidates on Mitch McConnell, and eventually Mitch McConnell buckled and took them on. So it is entertaining this morning to hear reports that Trump has been fulminating about what a shitty candidate Dr. Oz was.
Dr. Oz.
You got
I
what you
love that.
fucking paid for, pal. Like,
I
sorry,
hate my candidate.
right.
But can I tell you, just to before we are too popping the champagne corks here, I think it's going to work out okay. But we should understand that there's a theoretical possibility that on December 7th we could be sitting around talking about Mitch McConnell as a winner. I mean, there is still
Yes.
there's still a struggle for the Senate
possible.
that is to play out.
I
And
absolutely do not-
weirdly, what I think, would almost guarantee a Warnock victory in the runoff would be if Trump declares his presidential candidacy. I think
Yes. That would help.
that will send Democratic turnout through the roof. So once again, we may have to be saying thank you, Donald Trump, for the Senate. If
No, I
it's a-
absolutely do not think that Mitch McConnell was a loser. I think that he was right. I think that his saying, he literally said that candidate quality matters.
Yeah.
And Trump has forced him into this thing. I don't think he was a loser at all. And let's not forget, in 2024, all the seats that are up are the ones that were blue waved in
From 18.
in 2018. So that's going to be an incredibly difficult map for Democrats to hold on to. So I don't think McConnell always plays the long game, and I don't think he hasn't lost the game that he's playing yet. One thing I would like to say, though, is that I have this fantasy that what happened this morning on First Street at the Supreme Court was John Roberts walking into the cloakroom and being, "I told you so."
Don't do this.
Right?
Don't do this.
To Alito, to
That's right.
Thomas, to Kavanaugh, to Barrett, to the extremists that decided to overturn Roe v. Wade in
Entirely.
the most extremist way, as opposed to doing what Roberts suggested, which was killing Roe v. Wade nonetheless, but doing it quietly without saying it out loud. The Roberts strategy probably saves Republicans, probably produces the Republican red wave that they were hoping for, but they went with the Alito strategy, and this is what they got. And so I think John Roberts, to the extent that the Supreme Court cares about politics, and they do.
Follows the election returns, as Mr.
And-
Doolittle said.
But
Right?
can I also?
I think that Roberts' strategy probably is showing even to his conservative colleagues how smart Roberts is when it comes to this stuff. Let's not also forget that a big story. This is what I'm writing about for The Nation, which you should totally read. That a huge story here are the gifts. This election, to the extent that Republicans are going to take back the House and are still very close to taking back the Senate, these are gifts from John Roberts to the Republican Party. Not just in the 2013 decision where he gutted the Voting Rights Act, but in the 2021 decision in Rucho v. County Common Cause, where he allowed gerrymanders to go supercharged. You don't have a Republican House right now if you're not allowed to gerrymander Florida, Texas, and
Ohio.
Alabama in the way that they have, right? So this is the fact that Republicans are still in the game and are probably still going to win the House. That is a direct one-to-one gift from John to the rest of the party. So I think that he's actually kind of a winner here. His political acumen has once again saved the Republicans bacon, and if they had listened to him on abortion, it would have saved them even more.
So Elie is brilliant at turning a question about Mitch McConnell into a discussion of the Supreme Court, which is not an inappropriate connection. But
It is
let me
inappropriate.
take it back via Elie to Mitch McConnell, because you didn't mention the decision that Roberts organized that actually made Mitch McConnell who he is, and that's Citizens United. And here's the big deal. The lost story of 2022 is that this was the year that Mitch McConnell, to a greater extent even than any time in the past, solidified his relationship with the big checkbook billionaire donors. He was running them more effectively and moving more money than anybody else in Washington. And there is simply no doubt that his marshaling of billionaire money through a variety of avenues, that's what saved Ron Johnson. There is simply no doubt of that. That's what saved J.D. Vance, who Mitch McConnell hated. And yet, when Peter Thiel cut the money off for J.D. Vance, it was Mitch McConnell who literally moved in tens of millions of dollars. And so Mitch McConnell is not a loser here. In fact, he actually got out of 2022 a relationship that, as Elie points out, in 2024, you're going to see him as far more central than Trump, far more central than DeSantis or any of these other players It will be Mitch McConnell who will sit with the billionaires and decide where the money goes.
So Virginia Johnson asks, how do we get rid of Citizens United? And I want to also shout out to Janet Clemenson, who put it into the chat when we were talking about John Roberts. And I guess, one answer or another way to answer Virginia Johnson's question is, what are the pieces of the coalition? In other words, the Republicans are always going to have billionaires. They are the party of organized money. And, it's true that under Bill Clinton, the Democrats became the other party of organized money. But that's a race the Democrats are never going to win. So, what are the elements of the coalition? What do we see as key shoots of hope from this morning, and where do we take them, or where do we think they need to go for 2024 in order to oppose this tidal wave of money, which is happening? There's always a green wave, whether there's a red wave or a blue wave.
I think, we do see the sort of elements of nascent coalition in the results today. It is about the right to reproductive choice. It is about racial injustice and rising inequality, which are, the features of the economy that the billionaires want. So, and I think John, in pointing out the Michigan story, which is, I think, an encouraging model, reminds us, that historically the Democrats have been the party of working people. And it's funny, I will confess, I started reporting a gloom and doom column before last night's results, and I was interviewing a former Clinton White House first term speechwriter who said, like, coming into the 94 debacle of the Republican Revolution, you had not Clinton himself, but all the people we've been talking about, the DC savvy set, saying basically forbidding use of the word union on the 1994 campaign trail.
Exactly.
And that was because, again, these were the new Democrats. They were shedding themselves of all these constituencies, which very much included African Americans. Remember the Sister Soldier moment. Very much was and we haven't even talked about the phantom issue of crime this cycle. Like,
Right.
But Bill Clinton was the capital punishment supporting president who executed Ronnie Rector off the campaign trail to show what a tough on crime asshole he was. So, we have here, I think, a way to thread these, incipient movements together under a banner of broadly speaking, economic justice. And I think, again, Fetterman's victory is an augur in that direction. I think even though, Ryan was never going to win in Ohio did do really well in terms of the congressional delegation. And I think Ryan helped elevate those candidates by harping on economic justice. So who knows? The problem, of course, as Don alluded to, is Democratic candidate, or the Democratic Party has its own millionaire and billionaire donors, and they very much don't want to run in that direction. So there is an institutional tension at the heart of articulating a strategy like this. So
yeah, and Stacey Abrams and Raphael Warnock, I believe, outspent their opponents. And we really won't know until
They out fundraised them until the last quarter. We don't know how much money.
Yeah, exactly, Don. But money was not an issue here. How money was spent might have been an issue. I think that people were frustrated with Warnock for putting more money into television ads than on the ground. There's a debate about that. If he pulls it out, I'm, all power to him. But there really was not as much investment in mobilizing voters in the last month or so as there was in certainly the runoff in 2021. So, money is not everything. obviously.
It's a lot.
Because it doesn't cost $1 billion to buy the Democratic Party a Rosetta Stone course to learn Spanish, right? Like, it doesn't cost a lot of money. And
Well-
we would be benefited if we had more candidates who advertise on Spanish language television and Spanish language sources, right? Like they're small d technocratic democratic ways to kind of cut around some of this stuff, because what we see ultimately is that billions and billions of dollars, like, how many votes is that really buying you? I'm not saying it's not going to buy you some votes, but like it's a marginal amount of votes compared to groundwork, compared to good candidates, compared to smart advertising, compared to all of these other stuff that go into an electoral pie. I kind of go back to the idea that, like, Democrats tend to not get in the game on some of, it's what you guys were saying earlier about kind of going to all of the rural counties. Like, you need to actually, like, be with your feet on the ground in the game to have any chance to win these races. And too often Democrats kind of stay up here, right? And don't get down into the muck. And I think if you do, and that doesn't cost a lot of money to do, right? Especially when you talk about flipping Congress. Senate, some states kind of different, but especially when you start talk about flipping Congress, it's small d, really basic campaigning stuff the Democrats just don't do as well as the Republicans. And if we did that, and then you have to deal with gerrymandering, so we'd still lose, and so I don't know what I'm talking about. But,
No, but Elie, there's a thing here that's important, and this is that we're talking about elections, and we shouldn't be talking about elections. We should be talking about politics. And if we were serious about politics, what we would recognize is that if the Democrats took down their ads nationally for one day during this election cycle, let's say October 18th, they just took the ads down, I promise you they would have tens of millions of dollars from across the country if they put that money into funding of rebuilding their party apparatus in every county, every one of the 3,700 counties in the United States. Then they would have something permanent that was real, that was actually in contact with real people. And so they could fund it with one day of their TV ads. But I promise you that, while that sounds completely logical, I think, on this conversation, if you said that inside a DNC, DSCC, DCCC, any of these groups, they would look at you like you were out of your mind. Because the de-link between democratic strategy at the top and actual politics is almost complete. These people do not deal in politics, they deal in elections, and their whole theory is, how do we put a bunch of pieces together for this election, then let it fall apart, and then try and figure out how to put it together for the next election. And that is a deeper crisis that we will settle in the next 8 minutes.
8 minutes. So thank you for bringing our attention back to the clock. We don't have time for a ton of more questions. And yet there are two words that nobody has mentioned, and one word that we talked about a little bit. The word we talked about a little bit is crime. And I guess I would love to hear whether any of you think that any of the candidates show that the Democrats have figured out how to talk about crime, because I listened and I didn't hear it. The words we haven't mentioned are, wait. Hold on, John. The words that nobody's mentioned are immigration and climate. And, we're talking about putting together a winning coalition, a progressive coalition, not just a coalition that wins on election day and falls apart. So I'd like to hear from all of you, and I'm gonna save you for the middle, John.
Okay. I've got my crime one. I got a
crime, immigration, climate. Where does that fit into what you've been paying attention to? Elie, why don't I start with you?
I'll do climate because to me, this is a huge issue for young voters, and it dovetails with the thing that I always talk about, which is the Supreme Court. So if you look at what Republicans did, if you look kind of macro level, last 30, 40 years, how Republicans took over the Supreme Court, what they did is they tied Supreme Court control to a couple of key issues for voters in their coalition, specifically abortion rights, which they've won, and gun rights, which they've won. Right. And every time they talked about gun rights or abortion rights, they talked about it in the context of the Supreme Court, which then gave voters a reason to go to the polls election after election after election, even though the Republican Party was doing, in 1994, absolutely nothing to take away to secure about abortion rights or gun rights, right? Like when they were legislatively stymied, they kept tying it to the Supreme Court to give voters a reason to go to the polls every election cycle, and those created single issue voters on the Supreme Court because not because the average, Republican voter understands civics and the separation of powers or whatever, but because they understood about gun rights and abortion rights and eventually gay rights. Democrats can do the same thing, especially around the issue of client, where there will be no legislative victories for the foreseeable future. Not just because you don't have a broad enough coalition, because basically too many old people in government to actually build real meaningful climate legislation, but because the Supreme Court is sitting there willing to strike down literally anything Democrats can think of to ameliorate climate legislation. So you have to tie climate to the Supreme Court and tell young voters, if you care about climate, we need you to show up to vote for the Supreme Court because it's the only way it's going to happen. So I think that's I know that's right. I know it from watching you, right? I know it from watching how Republicans made the sauce, trying to convince Democrats to just do what the Republicans did, but for good, is just, it's why I have a job, because it's really hard.
Okay. Joan and John and Chris, you each got a minute. So Joan, you go first, and I'm going to give Chris the last word, and I'm going to give John the penultimate word.
I would love to believe that Elie is right about that strategy. I hope they try it out. I think that right now, with such a deficit, being down 6-3 in the Supreme Court, it's kind of mind numbing. It's at least maybe this is just me, but it feels like it's going to take a long time. And I guess climate is worth it. Everything we do should be prioritized around climate, but I wasn't hearing very much about that on the campaign trail. And I think that that's interesting, given that we all agree, we all here certainly agree that it's such a crisis. So I'd love to see it tried.
Okay, thank you. John, a minute. Oh, you're muted.
Talking about crime and the culture war issues. I know that I talk too much about Wisconsin, but it is still the greatest place in the world. And in Wisconsin, Tony Evers, the governor of Wisconsin, in the final stage, he put up ads that they were put up actually, I think, by a group backing him, but they were fantastic. They had his opponent going on about crime, going on, and then they would split screen and go to Tony Evers and says, Tony Evers, he just can't get his mind off lowering costs and getting gas prices down and stuff like that. And then they'd put up something that his opponent was saying on culture war stuff, and they'd say, Tony Evers, he just can't stop thinking about inflation. And the fact of the matter is, they actually did a brilliant job of juxtaposing the use of issues to divert people from the core of the campaign to what people are actually associating with. And they took the issue of inflation back from the Republicans and gave it to Evers. It was an incredibly successful ad campaign. I invite people to look at it rather than me describe it. But the bottom line is, you have to confront these issues and then show them to be the strategies that they are, rather than simply running away from them or even getting into a tit for tat that never succeeds.
Chris, key steps in putting together the winning coalition, crime.
Crime and climate. I again want to pause to second everything everyone else has said. I think with regard to the crime issue, it's really interesting. A lot of progressive DAs, after all of this crime talk, won. So this is another one of these issues that Elie was describing earlier that seems to have salience among the pundit class, among people who think of themselves as insiders who are mystically in touch with what real people are thinking. And it turns out real people are thinking about other stuff, which is not to say there aren't important ways in which to engage the crime issue in a more honest way. I think economic crime, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but let's talk about white collar crime. Let's talk about, the Trump family as an organized crime family. They are under indictment in New York for, not even having to do with constitutional abuses.
And Tish James had a good night last night.
Yeah. So I think, there are ways to flip the script, as John was sort of indicating. It's also interesting, going back for a moment to Michigan, talking about the culture war stuff, which is not something you brought up, but I'm going to opportunistically bring it in here. Like the whole critical race theory bullshit that we suffered through over the past year seems to have fallen pretty flat from what I've seen in a lot of school board races and, congressional races that sought to capitalize on it. We didn't see a rush of candidates, who won because of litter boxes in schools or whatever the hell they're making up now. So it seems like these public goods, like public education, is something that people really value. And again, I'm going to be the boring economic determinist here, but as the model of economic opportunity in this country. So, Democrats have disastrously, in my view, run against it. Arne Duncan was a huge school privatizer under Obama, and
Right.
the race to the top, or whatever bullshit name they gave that initiative, just, keeps people on the STEM treadmill and, teaching to the test. And, at some point you have to and this, is a bit idealistic, but, vindicate public education for its original purposes, which is to create an informed citizenry. Same thing for the media, our business.
All right, sorry, Chris, we're
Yeah.
gonna have to stop you on informed citizenship.
Yeah.
But, we can see the emergence of a winning coalition: public education, public goods, racial justice, economic justice, women's autonomy, the climate crisis, addressing it, taking it seriously. These are all potential winners for the Democratic Party. They are also issues that, if you care about them, you can read about every day in the nation. If you're a print subscriber, God bless you. If you're an online subscriber, God bless you. If you're just a print subscriber and you don't know about it, we publish 7 pieces every day online. So please come to www.thenation.com and look. And, if you're benefiting from this rising inequality and you want to feel a little better about it, we'll take your money. So with that, and with great thanks to my panelists, and also to Peter Rothberg and the team of Nation, Sarah Burke, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on names here, and I feel terrible because I'm terrible at names. But thank you all for a great panel, and for making it possible, and for all the work you do. And we look forward to seeing you in the future. And Joan, we look forward to seeing you back in Georgia.
Thanks, Ron.
So make friends down there.
I'm coming home tonight, though.
And tell them we'll be back soon. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being with us. Thank you, Katrina, for hosting and introducing us, and for all that you do. And we will see you all soon.